So chapter 2 is all about auditing IT governance controls. So our objectives are as follows. First is to understand the risk of incompatible functions and how to structure the IT function. Second is be familiar with the controls and precautions required to ensure the security of an organization's computer facilities. Third is to understand the key elements of a disaster recovery plan. And fourth is be familiar with the benefits, risk, and audit issues related to IT outsourcing. So basically, this chapter presents risk controls and test of controls related to the IT governance. So these are the things that we will be encountering on as we discuss this chapter. So let's start with defining what information technology governance is. So information technology or IT governance is a relatively new subset of corporate governance that focuses on the management and assessment of strategic IT resources. So the key objectives of the IT governance are to reduce risk and ensure that investments in IT resources add value to the corporation. So that is basically what IT governance is. Now, IT governance also follows the principle that all corporate stakeholders, including the BOD, the top management, and the departmental users like the accounting, the finance, or those users of your IT, of course, must have an active participation in key IT decisions. So, let's proceed. So you have here the IT governance controls. So there are basically three identified IT governance controls, namely the organizational structure of the IT function. So that's the first one. Excuse me. Second is the computer center operations, and third is a disaster recovery planning. So these three, we will be discussing it one by one as we go along this chapter or this video discussion. So let's start with the structure of the information technology function. So there. Now, the organization of the IT function has implications for the nature and effectiveness of internal controls, which in turn has implications for the audit. So in this part, some important control issues related to the IT structure are examined. So when we say the structure of the IT function, there are basically two kinds of structure. We have the centralized approach, and we also have the distributed approach. So first, let's start with the centralized data processing. So under the centralized data processing model, all data processing is performed by one or more large computers housed at a central site that serves, take note, central site that serves users throughout the organization. So let's take a look at two different figures here. So let's start with figure 2.1. So as you can see in this figure 2.1, this again shows a centralized data processing. So in this illustration, the IT services are consolidated and managed as a shared organization resource. So that is why the IT here is found at the center. So end users, mainly the marketing, production, accounting, distribution, finance, these are examples of your end users. So they compete for those resources on the basis of need. Therefore, as you can see, there are different legends here. This white arrow refers to the data, the black one information, and the cost chargeback. So as you can see here, The end users, these departments, provide data to the IT services. Then in turn, the IT service department provides information to the end users. And at the same time, they charge cost with their services, diba? So, as you can see here, the IT service function is usually treated as a cost center whose operating costs are charged back to the end users. So, meaning all those services that the IT provide in relation to the finance department will be charged to the finance. Same would go to the marketing, the production, and so on. So, this is an example of a centralized processing approach. Now, in figure 2.2, you will see here, this is an organizational chart of a centralized information technology function. So, as you can see here, you have the president, here, diba? President, and then the different vice presidents, and then you have here the IT services. So, the IT service is primarily divided into three service areas. So you have the data administration or the data administrator, you have the data processing, and then you have the systems development and maintenance. So we will define these areas one by one. So under systems development, you have new systems and systems maintenance. For data processing, you have data conversion, computer operations, and data library. So we will discuss that one by one. So let's start with the database administration. So centrally organized companies maintain their data resources in a central location that is shared by all users, as what you've seen in figure 2.1. Now, in this shared data arrangement, an independent group headed by the database administrator or the DBA, so DBA here means database administrator, it's responsible for the security and integrity of the database. So, the primary functions of the, or no, that is the primary function of the database administrator. Now, let's move on to the data processing. So, the data processing is the one that manages the computer resources used to perform the day-to-day processing of transactions. So, included therein is a data conversion, which refers, or its function is it transcribes transaction data from hard copy source documents into computer input. So for example, data conversion could involve keystroking sales orders into a sales order application in modern system or transcribing it into a magnetic media. So that is data conversion. While computer operation refers to wherein the electronic files produced in data conversion are later processed by the central computer, which is managed by the computer's operations group. So, accounting applications are usually executed according to a strict schedule that is controlled by the central computer's operating system. Then, lastly, we have the data library. So, the data library is a room adjacent to the computer center that provides safe storage for the offline data files. So that is your data library. Now, the last function is the systems development and maintenance. So the information system or the information system's needs of users are met by two related functions. You have the system development and the system maintenance. So those are two different things. No, the system development, they are the one responsible for analyzing user needs and designing new systems. So that is a function of the system development. So they are designing new systems to satisfy the needs of the end users. While the system maintenance is, of course, they maintain an already existing system. So the participants in a system development usually includes system professionals, end users, and stakeholders. So when we define system professionals, they include system analysts, database designers, and programmers who design and build the system. So the system professionals are the one that gather facts about the user's problems. They are the one that analyze the facts and formulate a solution. So the end product of their effort is, of course, a new information system. So it is important that you really have analysts and designers and programmers so that your information is, of course, would really be suitable to what your users really need. Now, your end users are those for whom the system is built. Of course, they are the end users. So, sila ang magamit sa imuhang system na gibuhat. So, they are the managers who receive reports from the system and the operations personnel who work directly with the system as part of their daily responsibilities. So when you create or when you develop a program, you should always keep in mind the user. So will this program that I'll be making user-friendly or not? Will a certain user find it difficult to generate a report? Will it find it difficult to do a certain task? Diba? So that are some of the things that you need to keep in mind when you are developing a system. So you should think of your end users. Next is the stakeholders. So the stakeholders are individuals inside or outside the firm who have an interest in the system but are not end users. So they include accountants, internal auditors, external auditors, and others who oversee systems development. So they are not primarily the user, but they also at some point in time may use your system, for example, during testing of controls and during audits. So those are just some of the examples. Next, we have the segregation of incompatible IT function. So if you remember in the previous chapter, one of the highlighted controls or in the physical controls was the segregation of duties. So even here in the IT services, there should still be segregation of IT functions. So specifically, operational tasks should be segregated to these three tasks should be segregated. So we have one. You have a separate, the person doing the transaction authorization should be separate from the one doing the transaction processing. Next, you should separate the record keeping from the asset custody. And lastly, you should divide the transaction processing task among individuals such that short of collusion between two or more individuals, fraud would not be possible. So if you can remember, this is just basically the same as what I have discussed when I discussed the segregation of duties in the physical controls. So again, you need to separate the custodianship, the one who does the authorization, and the one who does the record keeping. So those same, or it has the same foundation. Next is the, let's move on. So these are more specific segregation of incompatible IT functions. So here you need to separate the systems development from the computer operations, or if you remember those three main tasks, systems development and maintenance, database administration, and the data processing. So you should separate, or the segregation of the systems development and the operations activities is of great importance or significance. So The relationship between these groups should be extremely formal, and their responsibilities should not be co-mingled. Since systems development and maintenance professionals should create systems for users and should have no involvement in entering data or running applications. While operations staff or those doing the computer operations should run these systems and have no involvement in their designs. So as you can see, these functions are inherently incompatible, and consolidating them would invite or would be susceptible to errors and fraud. Since if you have both knowledge in the development and you are also a user of this system, diba? There is a tendency that it would create, or not really a tendency, it would really create a conflict of interest, because you might design something or include in the design something that would be used to do fraudulent transactions or fraudulent acts. Next is the separation of the database administration and the other function. So the DBA function is of course responsible for the number of critical tasks pertaining to data security, which includes creating the database schema and user views, assigning database access authority to users, monitoring database usage, and planning for future expansion. So as you can see, the tasks done by the database administrator are really vital tasks, diba? So delegating these responsibilities to other functions would would create a threat to the integrity of your database, since these functions are highly confidential, diba? So dili ra nimo basta-basta mahatag na nga task ni maskin kinsa. So if you are really if you're assigned as a database administrator, you should really be someone who has high moral and ethical standards, diba? That you will not be tempted to do fraudulent activities, diba? Kaya since this task carries a lot of weight, so you can be susceptible to a lot of things. So as much as possible is whoever is assigned to do the database administration is just really fixed to that certain task. Yeah? So again, do not delegate the task to other functions. Next is to separate the new systems development from the maintenance. So, but they are all under systems development, but the new systems development is separate from the systems maintenance. So, there are some companies who organize their in-house development function into two groups. We have the systems analyst and the programming the group. So, excuse me. The systems analyst group works with the users to produce detailed designs of the new system, while the programming group codes the programs according to these design specifications. So, under this approach, the programmer who codes the original programs also maintains the system during maintenance phase of the system development, because of course, he or she is the one knowledgeable on the program itself, because he or she is the one who coded it. So, siya po ang maka-maintain, diba, sa program itself. So, that is why it is important that the two functions, the one who does the analysis and the one who does the programming, is different. So after the centralized processing model, we have the distributed model. So the DDP or distributed data processing involves reorganizing the central IT function into small IT units that are placed under the control of the end users. So the IT units may be distributed according to business functions, geographic location, or both. So it depends on the company if unsa ang ilang ganahan. So when you say business function, it can be like by department. Like finance, marketing, production, and so on. When you say geographic location, especially if you are dealing with a larger company wherein they have different branches, so your units may be per branch. Like you have the Manila branch, so you have their own IT unit. You also have the Cebu, the Davao, the CDO. So that is an example of a geographic location. Now, let's take a look at figure 2.4 here. So figure 2.4 shows two distributed data processing approach. You have alternative A and alternative B. So alternative A is actually a variance of the centralized model. So as you can see, there's a centralized computer system. The difference is that the terminals or microcomputers are distributed to end users for handling input and output. So, as you can see here, diba, before, if you can remember, in the centralized figure, wala to siya yung mga computers, diba, mga functions na to siya. The processing of the data into information is done by the atong IT na function. However, in here, as mentioned, the different functions, business functions, already have or already the ones handling the input and the output na function. So, excuse me, this eliminates the need for the centralized data conversion groups since the users now performs this task. So, under this model, however, systems development, computer operations, and database administration remain centralized. So, more na siya ang mahibilin sa imuhang centralized computer system. All other functions like the inputting of data and then the generation of outputs and reports are done by the different na nga mga functions. In alternative B, as you can see, alternative B is very far more different than the centralized model if you compare A and B, no. So, this alternative distributes all computer services to the end users where they operate as standalone units. So, again, they operate as standalone units. So, the result is the elimination of the central IT functions. So, as you can see here, mo na yung difference, di ba? Wala na ning nasa tunga. So, it eliminates the central IT functions from the organizational structure. So, if you notice, there is the interconnection between the functions. So, accounting is connected to marketing and so on and so forth. So, these connections represent a networking arrangement that permits communication and data transfers between the units. So, the account, for example, the production line may send information to the accounting function, which in turn the accounting can send the information to the finance and the marketing and so on and so forth. So, this is an example of your distributed data processing. Now, we have the risk associated with your DDP. We have inefficient use of resources, destruction of audit trails, inadequate segregation of duties, hiring qualified professionals, and lack of standards. So when we say inefficient use of resources, this means that DDP can expose the organization to three types of risk associated with inefficient use of organizational resources. First, again, there are three types of risk. First is the risk of mismanagement of organization-wide IT resources by end users. Again, risk of mismanagement of organization-wide IT resources. Of course, because if you can remember, wala naman siya centralized na IT function. So, meaning those organization-wide IT resources, it would be hard to do the consolidation, diba? It would be hard to do the data administration because especially if the computers are spread out to different units or to different geological locations and the like. So the database administration function, the systems development, the maintenance would already be difficult. So for example, if a company would want to do a check-up on the system of a certain branch, so they really need to go to that branch to check the system because the system is found solely there. It is a standalone unit, diba? So kailangan pa sila mag-travel para lang i-check ang systems maintenance, or to do systems maintenance. Or same would apply to if mo to sila to a certain department or a certain branch and so on and so forth. Unlike if there is a centralized unit for the IT functions, they just have go to that specific unit and all other mga sub-units na ma-affected or dili na it would be less costly for the organization to do systems maintenance or to do developments sa ilahang system. The second risk is that DDP can increase the risk of operational inefficiencies because of redundant tasks being performed with the end user committee. So for example, the accounting and the finance, diba, they have per se sort of similar tasks. So the accounting may input customer information, which the finance department may also input customer information, and the marketing department would also input customer information, diba? So these three departments all need customer information, and if it is under DDP, so dili man shared ang ilahang database. So magkadoble na ang imong employee data na file, diba? Kay lahi-lahi man kada department. So of course, since they are not centralized, so that is one risk. Now the third risk is that the DDP environment poses a risk of incompatible hardware and software. The DDP environment poses a risk of incompatible hardware and software among end user functions. So, distributing the responsibility for IT purchases to end users may result in uncoordinated and poorly conceived decisions. So, for example, decision makers in different organizational units working independently may settle on dissimilar and incompatible operating systems, technology platforms, spreadsheets, word processors, and database packages, since technically they have no specialty in identifying the specific hardwares and so forth that could be used for the smooth flowing of the database. So, pwede, for example, ang Manila branch ilang gamit na OS is Mac na OS or iOS, while ang sa imuhang Cebu branch is ang gamit is Windows, and then your Davao branch is using Linux, diba? So there is na incompatibility with the operating system used by each geological location, and then thus would create further problems kasi mas lisod ang pag-share of data and information. So kana siya. Those are the risks associated with the inefficient use of resources. Next is you have the destruction of audit trails. So, an audit trail provides a linkage between a company's financial activities and the financial statements that report on those activities. So, auditors use the audit trail to trace selected financial transactions from source documents that capture the events through the journals, subsidiary ledgers, and the like. So in the DDP system, the audit trail consists of a set of digital transactions, files, and master files that reside in part or entirely on end user computers. So if an end user accidentally deletes one of the files, diba, it can no longer be traceable or accountable, diba? So it can no longer be unrecoverable. So those are some of the risk associated with DDP. Next is the inadequate segregation of duties. So the distribution of the IT function may result in the creation of small independent units that do not permit the desired separation of incompatible functions. So if you remember the different functions that we discussed that should be separated, since it would be each department or each function or katong mga geological location or mga business functions would already have their own IT per se, diba? So instead of the company would only have like per se 10 people who are really do different tasks, or there really is segregation of duties, ang mahitabo those 10 people might be spread out to the different functions or to the different branches nga sila ang mag-serve nga IT for that branch, di ba? Then for instance, instead of before they were only just doing database administrator, since karon is assigned naman sila to a specific branch and they are the only ones knowledgeable with IT functions. So there is a tendency nga kana siya nga person is siya na pud ang sa imong systems maintenance, siya na pud ang sa development, siya na pud ang sa imong data processing and everything, di ba? So mawala na noon to ang imuhang segregation of duties. Another risk is the hiring qualified professionals. So end user managers may lack the IT knowledge to evaluate the technical credentials and relevant experience of candidates applying for IT professional positions. So as I mentioned, diba, to compensate the katong lack of segregation of duties, so they can hire professionals. However, those people who are assigned in hiring those professionals are not really qualified, diba, to evaluate if unsa nga professional ang imuhang kailangan. So with that, if you are hiring unqualified professionals, it would then increase the risk that there will be mga errors, diba, nga iyang buhaton or mga system failures and the like, since dili day not knowledgeable na person ang imuhang gi-hire. And then lastly is the lack of standards. So because of the distribution of responsibility in the DDP environment, standards for developing and documenting systems, choosing programming language, acquiring hardware and software, and evaluating performance may be unevenly applied or even non-existent. So those are the risks associated with DDP. Now let's move on to the advantages. So there are 4 stated advantages, no? First is the cost reduction. So for for DDP, since there are no centralized locations or there are no centralized systems, diba? So powerful and inexpensive computers are not really necessary, since they are not dealing with large volumes of transactions and the like, because of course they are divided into different na nga mga functions, no? So those mga expensive computers or those powerful computers are really not necessary anymore. So the company can now acquire units that only need smaller data storage or that are really not that powerful, kay since dili man super daghan nga transactions ang imuhang buhaton ana nga computer kana nga system. So that is why the cost of acquiring those high quality fixed assets would not really be required. So meaning the DDP can reduce costs in those areas. So again, aside from the hardware na mga cost benefit, the DDP can also reduce cost through which data can be edited and entered by the end user, thus eliminating the centralized task of data preparation. So katong mga tasks to do the data preparation is wala na to siya nga function. So dili na ka necessary na mag-hire og person to do that. And then next, the application complexity can be reduced, which in turn reduces system development, and maintenance costs. Another advantage is improved cost control responsibility. So end user managers carry the responsibility for the final success of their operations. This responsibility requires that they be properly empowered with the authority to make decisions about resources that influence their overall success. So, proponents of the DDP said that the benefits of improved management attitude more than outweigh any additional costs incurred from distributing these resources. Next is the improved user satisfaction. So, of course, since the DDP is already distributing some of the functions to end users, therefore the tasks of the end users can be done more faster. So, meaning they can deliver to, they can deliver to their customers or to the end users pod nila in a more faster way according to their own set schedule, because of course they already have power as to the input, processing, the production of output sa ilahang system, diba? So it makes the work of the end user more efficient. So that's why. Thus, it increases user satisfaction. Then lastly is the backup flexibility. So DDP has the ability to back up computing facilities to protect against potential disasters such as fires, floods, and sabotage. Since, of course, they have separate man nga mga, either nakaseparate man ang mga functions or separate man like per branch. So, for instance, maskin na ay mahitabo sa isa ka function, like sa isa, for instance, accounting, diba? Dili super affected tanan nga mga functions. So, dili pod mawala ang file na nasa production, nasa marketing, because of course, the only one affected is the accounting. Unlike if centralized, if si central system nimo is mautoy masunugan or mabahaan or whatever, if something happens to that central system, diba? Affected na tanan kay ato man nag-base sa imong central location tanan. So if mawala to siya, domino effect na siya to the outside ng mga users or to the end users. So that is the advantage of DDP. Next is controlling the DDP environment. So in order to control the DDP environment, you need to implement a corporate IT function. So, the implementing a corporate IT function means that you really need to have individuals who are really knowledgeable with whatever is the task assigned to your IT function. So, if it needs individuals who are really good in programming or just maybe systems maintenance or the systems analysis, so we really need to have individuals who are really in that position to do the different mga IT functions na ito anang mention above, no? So here are some of the examples that a company might need in a corporate IT function. So you have the central testing of commercial software and hardware. Of course, you test what is compatible for your system, for your business, no? Another is you have the user services, wherein this activity provides technical help to users during the installation of new softwares and in troubleshooting and the like. So kana siya, more na siya kanang mga CSR ba, if ever na yung mga wala na hibaw na imong mga users sa inyong system, so kani sila ang mo-provide ana nga sila ang murag mo help sa imong mga end users. Next is the standard setting body. So of course, if you have a corporate IT function, so dapat na pod kay ginasunod na mga guidelines, mga protocols in the proper proper usage of your system and the like, diba? So muna siya. And then you also have the personal review. Of course, you need to evaluate the people in your IT function if they really are up to date, especially, diba? When you are talking about the IT function, it is really very essential that you need to adapt to changes because it is a fast-moving environment. So, meaning, dapat ka na yung mga tao dira is kabaw po na kung unsa ang mga on-trend or on-demand nga mga, or dapat unsa nga mga upgrades ang kailangan sa imuhang system. So, that person should also be knowledgeable po siya or up-to-date po siya. And then, next we have the audit objective. So, the audit objective is to verify the structure of the IT function. It's such that individuals in compatible areas are segregated in accordance with the level of potential risk and in a manner that promotes a working environment. Now, you have the audit procedures for a centralized IT function. First, there should be review of There should be a review of relevant documentation, including the current organizational chart, mission statement, job descriptions for key functions, determine if individual or groups are performing incompatible functions, and the like. Review systems documentation and maintenance for sample of application. So these are examples of how you can audit or audit procedures you have for a centralized IT function. Verify computer operators. Through observation, you determine the segregation policy if it is being followed. You review the operations room access logs if there are no unnecessary na mga accesses or mga mga dili dapat na mga access pero naa, so kana siya. Next is the audit procedures for a distributed na IT function. So basically it's mainly the same. So still, you verify the policies and the standards, you review the org chart, you verify the compensating controls, such as supervision, monitoring, you still review systems documentation, and the like. So these are your audit procedures. Now, let's move on to the computer center. So, the objective of these or the computer center is to present the risk of the computer centers and the controls that help mitigate the risk and create a secure environment. So the following areas kani siyang 6 kabuok or these are the following areas of potential exposure that can impact the quality of information, accounting records, transaction processing, and effectiveness of other more conventional internal controls. So these are the different computer centers. So we have the physical location. So of course, the physical location of the computer center directly affects the risk of destruction to a natural or a man-made disaster. So muna siya, physical location. So of course, imo na siya i-take into consideration. So, dapat ato nimo siya ibutang ang imong computer center in a safe place, di ba? Di nimo siya ibutang, for instance, sa lower ground, kay if ever ni mga baha-baha, so, at sa mga second floor or third floor or naka-elevate. So, muna siya example sa physical location, you need to take into consideration. Next is the construction. So, the construction, a computer center should be located in a single-story building of solid construction with controlled access. And then the utility line should be underground. The building window should not be open. And an air filtration system should be in place that is capable of extracting pollens, dust, and dust mites. You have the access. So, access to the computer access to the computer center should be limited to the operators and other employees who work there. So, kung kinsa na jud ang mga pwede dito, maka-access, mo sa gid ang makasulod. So, mo-apply na kagad mga physical controls, like butangan ni mong lock, di ba? Or na yung mga keycards, or biometrics, or the like. Next is air conditioning, of course. Computers, as you know, should function in, or computers function best in an air-conditioned environment, and providing adequate air conditioning is often a requirement of the vendor's warranty. So, di ba, ini-work din sa computer kay init na ba na siya niya? Init pag mo environment, so tendency is mag-overheat. So, muna kasagaran is air condition good. Then you have the fire suppression. So, of course, fire is the most serious threat to a computer, to a firm's computer equipment, diba? So, you should make sure na naay mga controls nag-implement, like naabay near na kanang kuan, what do you call that, mga hydrant, fire hydrant, or nabay mga fire alarms, or nabay mga sprinkler, diba, nabay duol ba sa fire exit, and so on and so forth. Then you have the fault tolerance. So, fault tolerance is the ability of the system to continue operation when part of the system fails because of hardware failure, application program error, or operator error. So, implementing fault tolerance control ensures that no single point of potential system failure exists. Total failure can occur only if multiple components fail. So, muna siya imuhang fault tolerance. So, sa imuhang computer center, your audit objective is to verify that physical security controls are adequate to reasonably protect the organization from physical exposures, and to verify that insurance coverage on equipment is adequate to compensate the organization for the destruction of or damage to its computer center. Now, your procedures is kani test of physical construction, test of fire detection system, access control, test of RAID, test of uninterruptible. So, kani siya mga examples sa imuhang mga audit procedures na pwede buhaton sa imuhang computer center. Next is ani na ta sa ato ang disaster recovery planning. So, disasters such as earthquakes, floods, sabotage, and even power failures can be catastrophic to an organization's computer center and information system. So, we'll see later at figure 2.6. So, the DRP, or Disaster Recovery Plan, is a comprehensive statement of all actions to be taken before, during, and after any type of disaster. So, there are the common phases, no? Yun siya ang kanang dapat na sa imuhang plan. First is sa imong plan, dapat ma-identify imong critical applications. You create a disaster recovery team, you provide site backup, and you specify backup and off-site storage procedures. So, anita sa figure 2.6. So, as you can see here in figure 2.6, there are 3 categories of disaster that can affect an organization's IT resources. So, you have natural, human-made, and system failure. So, kung yung tag-natural, of course, fire, flood, tornado. Diba? Di mo na ito ma-stop yun. When we say human-made, muna siya mga sabotage sa system or mga errors. When we say system failure, mga outage, power outage, drive failure, OS crash, or na-lock. So, those are examples of your mga disasters that can affect your system. So, you have first, as mentioned, to identify the critical application. So, the task of identifying critical items and prioritizing applications requires the active participation of user departments, accountants, and auditors. So, imong i-identify if unsa na mga elements or unsa na mga apps ang dapat dakog priority whenever it comes to na mga disasters nga mahitabo. So, for example, this is just for example ha. You put high priority to those mga information or data those those files containing confidential na mga information and data. So, meaning, kana sila mong hatagan og priority when it comes to the recovery, diba? So, mo na siya, imo nang ipang identify unsa nga mga things ang hatagan nimo focus and so on and so forth. So, mo na sa imuhang identify critical applications. Next is, you create a disaster recovery team. So, of course, if you want to recover from a disaster, you need to create or have a set of people who will do the task, or sila jud ang dapat mangunay, diba? Because if you wanna recover right away, you need to do it on a timely corrective manner or timely corrective action. So, for example, if there are delays in doing or in performing recovery or recovery task, diba? There are instances na nari specific time period para ma-recover pa na nimo nga data or information baron, diba? So, mo nang as much as possible na naka disaster recovery team para whatever kind of disaster might happen, na kay murag na itig sagup bitaw nimo. Yan na siya ba? So, kana siya. In order to really identify, or they are the ones who will really decide on what actions should be done in order to recover from that specific disaster. Next is you provide second site backup. So, when we say a second site backup, so meaning it provides for a duplicate data processing facility if there is a disaster. So, for example, na ay earthquake, diba? So, ang katay mohang original na office is dili na ninyo magamit. So, there is another site wherein you can still work, diha mo mag-do sa recovery, diha mo mag-do sa rebuilding, and the like. So, you have, for example, the common options. You have the mutual aid pack. You have the empty shell or the cold site and the recovery operations center or the hot site. So, when you say mutual aid pack, it is an agreement between two or more organizations with compatible computer facilities to aid each other with their data processing in needs of a disaster. So, of course, nagsabot na ka with a different organization no, na if ever ma-inanimi, so, you will help us, and if ever kamo pod ang maka-encounter of disaster is you will help you in na sense. Of course, you have compatible computer facilities. Now, when we say empty shell or cold site, it refers to an arrangement wherein the company buys or leases a building that will serve as a data center. So, ano siya, ato sila mag-rebuild sila system, di ba? When we say recovery operations center, it is a fully equipped backup data center that many companies share. So, kana siya. Kani is empty, manang empty shell siya kay kamo pa man ang mag-start ra didto og buhat og data center. Sa ROC is ang kato siya nga place is made gyud siya for backup na data center. Ina na siya. So, dili ra kamo ang na dito in case of mga backup. So, they also cater to other nga mga clients, no? Then, there are also instances wherein you can internally provide backup. So, through mirror data center, or if inyong backup system is through the cloud, so, ina na siya. Now, in here, sa imong recovery plan is or disaster recovery planning is your objectives. Auditor should verify that management's disaster recovery plan is adequate and feasible for dealing with a catastrophe that could deprive the organization of its computing resources. So, dapat i-check nimo if na ba sila DRP, ang kana certain nga entity, no? Then your procedures would include site backup, critical application list, software backup, data backup. So, imo ni ipang check if nag-exist ba ni siya nga mga butang, di ba? And if they have, for example, disaster recovery team, pila ka book ang members sa ilang disaster recovery team, are those personals nga part sa team really equipped, nga makatabang ba jud sila, ingon ana, di ba? What are their backup procedures nga gibuhat, kanus sila magduog backup, na asa ilang backup location, and so on and so forth. So, yun na siya, muna siya ang mga pills sa imong mga audit procedures. Lastly is the outsourcing the IT function. So, when you outsource or when a company outsources their IT function, so third-party vendors who take over responsibility for the management of IT assets and staff, and for delivery of IT services such as data entry, data center operations, applications development, applications maintenance, and network management. So, by the name itself, di ba, i-outsource naman mga IT function. So, the benefits of IT outsourcing include improved core benefits performance, improve IT performance, and reduce IT costs. Because, of course, ang imo sang kaon nga IT source is kabawsad ka nga mao gina ang ilahang specialty, di ba? The professionals they have are really knowledgeable of the IT functions. So, ikaw company, dili na ka mahago mismo nga ikaw pa ang mangita og mga IT professionals, ikaw pa yung magdo sa hiring and so on and so forth. Diba? Ikaw pa yung magdo sa training and unsa pa na din ha. Kani is, ang third party naman ang nagabuhat ana tanan. So, imo is you are just paying them for their services. So, the inherent risk to IT outsourcing would include failure to perform because of course, it is a third party, di ba? And there are tendencies nga dili ra ikaw ang ilahang giservan nga client. So there are tendencies nga dili jud ikaw permi ang first on the list or dili jud nga ang priority is grabe kaayo tungod kay lagi third party raman sila, so di man jud necessarily nga what happens to you would affect them as well. Kaya dili naman ikaw ang ilang client. So, yun, ana siya. Next is the vendor exploitation. So, when you say vendor exploitation, these large-scale IT outsourcing involves transferring of a vendor-specific asset, such as design, development, and maintenance of unique business applications that are critical to an organization's survival. So, muna siya ang imuhang vendor exploitation. So, basically, si vendor, ang katimuhang provider is iyang i-exploit ang imuhang dependency towards niya ba. So, muna siya. So, basically, if tanan na lang nimong IT functions is isalig nimo adto, so mag-agad si vendor is more siya na ay power over you. More siya inana ba. The next is outsourcing costs exceed benefits. Of course, dapat nagyapon kay cost-benefit analysis. So, if the vendor or the IT firm that you outsource is asking you to pay so much more than what you would benefit from them, so, di ba? Pwede na siya mahitabo. And then reduce security. Reduce security because remember that the data and information that are processed by the IT function, some may be confidential. And then those people who have access to those information are not really from your company. They are from a third-party company. So that is why they can be prone to mga leakage, di ba? Or na mga confidentiality threats. And then lastly is loss of strategic advantage. So, of course, since you have no control over your IT functions, which can be a big help in increasing your efficiency, effectiveness, and the like, diba? If you would like to make changes to those IT functions, if you would like to make changes to those functions to increase your competitive advantage and the like, or diba na discover na new strategies to increase sales, which would then affect na dapat mao ni ang button sa imong system and so on and so forth. So you cannot easily do that because you have no control over your IT system since you are just outsourcing it. So it can be a loss of strategic advantage. Then you have the audit implications of IT outsourcing. So the statement on auditing standard number 70 is the definitive standard by which client organizations auditors can gain knowledge that controls at the third-party vendor are adequate to prevent or detect material errors that could impact the client's financial statements. So that is the end of chapter 2.